Audiobook Always Visible, Another Prayer for the Dying Horror Genre, by Vitaly Ivolginsky. Based on the motion picture Omen IV, The Awakening. 10th chapter. Sorry again, Mr. Jordan Thurlow, Inspector Galbraith interrupted the prisoner for the second time. From now on, I would like you to give only the main points of your story regarding Delia Yonce and her family. All right, as you will, Joe agreed. To be honest, I'm tired tame the tongue. In general, as soon as Delia once visited the house of her neighbor, Jordan Thurlow, she became his frequent guest. For the last half of the summer and all of September, she, with or without her mother, visited Joe on any occasion, clearly reveling in every minute of her visits. What did they not do? Basically, she simply had intimate conversations with the owner of the house, who knew how to listen to her, and often sat next to her when he read books from his library aloud to her, and sometimes spent time in the kitchen helping Joe and Mother, in cases when she honored this house with her visit, cook according to recipes that he asked his friend and colleague Japhet over the phone. Mr. Thurlow was on good terms with Mrs. Yvette Yonce herself. They got along well and told each other a lot. Pretty soon Joe found out exactly how his new neighbors met. As Yvette told him, she, being the daughter of a farmer, who at one time moved from Avero to New York, at 22 married her college friend, but alas, her first marriage was unhappy. Mr. Senator, who not only was her peer, was also extremely capricious and picky in character. While married to him, Yvette constantly heard obsessive requests from him so that she would discard all romantic illusions and give birth to an heir as quickly as possible. To this, the then Mrs. Senator invariably answered him that the decision to give birth is primarily the woman's initiative, and if her husband really wants to have a child, then let him first devote himself to more serious activities than golf in the company of drunk friends. But this was not the only matter. Yvette had problems with pregnancy. In the 2 years she spent married to this man, she had 2 miscarriages, which also did not benefit their union. In the end it all ended with Mr. Senator divorcing her, which put her in a very disadvantageous position. In fact, Yvette had nowhere to go. Her father farmer did not want to house an adult woman who was already an independent person in the full sense of the word. Out of grief, Yvette went to a certain spa in Verona, where she met her, then still future, second husband, Mr. Yonce, who treated his bronchi there. They mutually fell in love with each other at first sight, meeting for the first time in the hall near the fountain. The fact that he was 20 years older than her was not a hindrance. Next day, when it was lunch hour, the pharmaceutist sat next to her as she sat alone at the table. After talking about life, the two of them went to the spa's garden, where Yvette gave Mr. Yonce an apple, which he, having taken from her hands, began to eat, but immediately threw it on the ground, because it turned out to be wormy. Taking advantage of a man's confusion, the woman rushed to him and kissed him right there, under the tree, after which she rushed out of the garden to let the pharmaceutist know that he would take further actions himself. And Mr. Yonce did not hesitate. When the next day there was dancing at the sanatorium, he invited Yvette to tango, and after several circles they began to order alcoholic cocktails. As a result, this resulted in the fact that, being in a tipsy state, the woman decided to take the pharmaceutist to her room, where, without unnecessary foreplay, they immediately fell on the bed and gave vent to their feelings. The next morning, waking up in the same bed, Mr. Yonce in the heat of love told Yvette that he wanted to leave the sanatorium with her immediately, so that they could live together, to which she agreed without further ado. However, the pharmaceutist was in no hurry to marry her. As a result, they lived for a long time in his apartment in New York just as roommates. When her lover was missing at work, Yvette, having nothing better to do, read the books he kept at home. She was impressed by the work of a certain B. Taggart, which, in fact, gave the expectant mother an idea of what to name her child. Yvette found out quite quickly that she was having a girl. Medical ultrasonography, which she did 2 months after meeting the pharmacist, made it clear that that night spent in the Verona spa was not in vain. Out of curiosity, she decided to play with her lover in game Guess What I'll Name Our Baby, but after the pharmaceutist's futile attempts, Yvette opened up to him that their daughter will be named Delia, because according to the book by B. Taggart this name means always visible, which will bring good luck to their heiress. Yvette remembered that when Mr. Yonce heard this, he walked around for several days in deep confusion, the reason for which he never revealed to her. When Joe heard it from her lips, he thought that apparently the point was that the pharmacist had always dreamed of a son, but he did not tell his interlocutor anything about his guesses. Be that as it may, it was the fact of Delia's conception that became the impetus for the further rapprochement of Yvette and Mr. Yonce. 10 days before the birth of the heiress, the latter took care of obtaining a marriage license, and when the girl was finally born, and it was in the morning, pharmaceutist, upon leaving the maternity hospital, immediately took the happy young mother to his close friend, where a special person who arrived there held a marriage registration ceremony, after which the newlyweds of different ages began to live a happy family life. Yvette didn't tell Joe why, after 8 years, the whole family decided to move from New York to Portland. Based on her hints, he assumed that there was something more serious behind this than the baby's complaints about life in a small apartment, but, be that as it may, he decided not to go into this topic. But Mr. Thurlow talked not only with Mrs. Yonce herself. He was also very interested in communicating with her little daughter. They were so good with each other that when Joe had to travel to the center for work, usually for 5 days, but sometimes for a week, then the young heiress of the Yonce family immediately deteriorated, and the little one fell into a state that could be roughly described as a mixture of boredom and sadness. She was still far from depression. At such moments, she seemed to be locked inside herself, nothing brought her pleasure, and to her parents' attempts to try to make her laugh, she responded only with a look in which a certain reproach was felt. Even her usual love for sweets faded at such moments, no matter what they offer her, ice cream, cake or fruit. Little girl, without saying a word, pushed the plates away or shied away from the hands helpfully extended to her. Only school, which started in September, began to bring her joy and pleasure in those moments when her neighbor was not at home. Apparently, it was due to the fact that the elementary school where she studied was located in the same area where Mr. Thurlow worked. They did not intersect at such moments for obvious reasons, and it was mutual consent. Neither Joe went to school nor Delia ran to him from classes, but it seemed that the fields of waves emanating from them intersected in this place. As for the school affairs of the young heiress of the Yonce family, she, contrary to Joe's suspicions, was not a bully. Delia had the fortitude to stand up for herself at some points, but she herself never got into a fight and she never, do you understand? Never occurred to bully her peers. It happened that, having witnessed bullying, the girl immediately came to victim's defense, and it even happened that the hooligans later asked her forgiveness for unworthy actions, but none of those who knew her could describe her as an damned wretch. She didn't have many friends. If Delia were asked who she was friendly with among her classmates, then she, after a little thought, would single out 2 girls, daughters of people who worked with her father. Both of her friends were 6 months older than her, and by nature they were somewhat arrogant, excellent students who put themselves a little higher than herself. At first, Delia didn't even pay much attention to them, but when she one day saw how a boy from another class called them bad words, she reprimanded him. Involuntarily aroused respect on their part. Most likely, it was simply beneficial for them to have such a girl as a girlfriend who would protect them. And if anyone had asked who she had warm feelings for, Delia would have blushed and pointed her finger at the boy with golden curly hair who invariably sat closer to the teacher's desk. This boy was the same Jerry, born Jerome, the son of Taylor Myron, one of the richest listing brokers in Portland. The parents decided to send the boy to the school they themselves went to as a child, although in terms of status it would be more appropriate for him to study at an institution with a higher reputation. But what could he do? The will of his parents is adamant. At this school, Jerry Myron felt much like a prince disguised as a pauper. He looked down on his classmates, tried to stay away from everyone, and when other boys tried to offer him friendship, he looked at them with an arrogant look. It is not surprising that he often became the cause of fights in class, when the most hooligan boys got tired of this untainted angel and tried to take out their childhood anger on him. Tried, because the young heiress of the Yonce family, who, as was already known, always stood up for the weak, took Jerry under her, shall we say, protection from the very first day. True, on those days when, for family reasons, she was absent from classes, the hooligans seemed to break loose and, trying not to catch the eyes of the teachers, beat up her love interest during breaks. In general, Jerome Myron, who at school was a direct target for other people's insults, was dear to Delia. She could not say for what qualities she fell in love with him, but she was always pleased to realize that she could be useful to this golden-haired boy. Most of her thoughts related to school closely intersected with Jerry's personality. His name was something intimate to her, and whenever she had to talk about his identity, her cheeks turned red and her breathing became ragged. Alas, the feeling was far from mutual. The culprit of her love torments was, how should I put it, not particularly delighted with this. Jerry, of course, did not quarrel with the girl who protected him from the attacks of other boys, but he didn't reciprocate her in any special way. Personally, he liked another girl much more who was in the same class, Tessie Perillo, daughter of a certain bookseller. She was a tall blonde, who, like Jerry himself, despised others and kept herself apart from everyone. Actually, it was precisely because of this nature of his passion that the boy could not make friends with her. It was as useful as starting a relationship with your reflection in the mirror. So little Myron, secretly sighing for the young lady Perillo, was friends with this dark-haired gal, whose face for some reason made him associate with a chihuahua. Jerry had never said something like that out loud, both in conversation with everyone else and with the young heiress of the Yonce family herself, but it was clear from his eyes that he was forcibly tolerating this girl, from whom he had only one benefit: protection from bullies. Be that as it may, Delia was head over heels in love with this boy, and she took advantage of any opportunity to cross paths with the listing broker's son. For example, one day she and her father went into a grocery store, where, by a happy coincidence, Jerry himself was with his mother, Miriam Myron. Seeing him, the girl immediately rushed to the boy with joy and, taking his hand, said that she wanted to go with him to La Boutique Fantasque. Luckily for her, young Myron did not resist her, and the children left the store, followed by the surprised glances of their parents. Delia led him into the shop where they were met by an old man who somehow reminded the girl of Einstein, only without a mustache. He was wearing a white shirt and a black leather vest. He had something to show his little visitors. At first, the children looked at small toy animals that danced the tarantella, and then the owner of the shop showed them a table on which a toy train rode by itself. Delia and Jerome stood shoulder to shoulder, gazing wide-eyed at the wonders of La Jugueteria Fantastica. When the self-propelled toy train made a couple of circles, the girl took advantage of the moment and quietly took the boy's hand in hers, squeezing it with all her might. From excitement her palm was very hot and sticky with sweat. Perhaps that is why Jerry suddenly broke free and ran out of this shop without a word. Baby girl looked after him with tears in her eyes, while the old owner grunts something displeasedly at the listing broker's ill-mannered son. The girl returned to the grocery store, where at that time her father was arguing with Miriam Myron about the fact that he allegedly allows his daughter to just take other people's children to an unknown place. At the sight of young Lady Yonce, the Jerry's mother calmed down a little and, without even sparing a glance at the girl, she took her son by the arm and went home, while Mr. Yonce quietly scolded Delia, who silently looked after Jerry. But one time the golden-haired object of her unrequited love did Delia a favor. It was mid-September when his parents took their son to their summer cottage for a few days, which, by a happy coincidence, was located not far from the home of the Yonce family. Jerry did not notify his classmate about this, but Delia, accidentally seeing him at the market, where she was shopping with her mother at that moment, hardly hiding her joy, she asked the boy about what fate he had ended up here. At that moment, Jerry, languishing with melancholy in a country setting he didn't like, decided to brighten up his loneliness a little and without hiding told her the address where the Myron family's summer cottage was located, and also the time at which he will wait for him. Delia then couldn't sleep a wink all night, thinking about how she would meet Jerry. And so, when the time came to leave the house in order to arrive at the right time, she ran there without any second thoughts, almost glowing with happiness. However, when the girl was already there was not a soul in the Myron's cottage. Cunning Jerry, who wanted to laugh at a naive girl, specially arranged a date with her for that day and hour when he and his parents were already driving in the car on the way home to the center. But Delia never found out about this trick. On the contrary, she got into her head the obsessive idea that this was her own fault, as if she herself had missed out on her happiness. When her father brought her to school the next day, she met Jerry in the hallway before class, walked up to him and, with downcast eyes, said to him sadly, "I'm sorry." The boy was surprised by her unexpectedly meek reaction, but without showing it, he played along with her state, saying it's I who should be sorry, and ran to class. That day, Delia, without responding to her friend's greetings, sat through all the lessons in the same position, and even when Charles Pevek, the most rowdy-dowdy boy in her class, apparently inspired by her condition, snatched the pen from her hands and was about to throw it in the trash can, the girl remained sitting in place, only raising her eyes, red from tears, to the bully. The young Pevek was confused and, after standing indecisively by the trash can, he walked up to Delia and put her pen next to her books. When, while visiting Mr. Thurlow, Delia shared this story with him, of course, without knowing the true state of affairs on Jerry's part, her interlocutor was somewhat amazed that this girl, whose whole nature seemed to be filled with the energy of life, could feel such a complex of guilt because of some mere trifle. Joe tried to calm the girl down by reading her a poem by some author with the strange surname Block, something about an accordion and buttercups, but the baby girl, shouting to him "I'm going out the play," ran to her home, not wanting to show neighbor her tears, which by that time were already filling her up from the inside. Both she and Joe were sad that day, only if her sadness was caused by impressions from a failed date, then her adult friend's was caused by her reaction to his attempts to somehow calm her down. For 2 days Delia did not go to her neighbor, being in a depressed state, but on the third day the girl perked up and again visited Mr. Thurlow, who, however, at that time was keen on reading a certain book, which made it seem to his young guest that he was not particularly pleased with her visit. To entertain the child a little, Joe first in front of her eyes burned that book, which didn't contain anything smart, and then invited the girl to go visit his friend Japhet, to which she agreed without further ado. From the 4th-floor apartment where Joe's colleague lived, the young heiress of the Yonce family brought back pleasant memories. Firstly, Jaff, who knew how to cook for real, unlike Mr. Thurlow who, trying to imitate him, threw a feast for her stomach. Upon arrival, he treated her to baked lamb shoulder and stewed beans on the way back. Secondly, Delia listened with great pleasure to a fairy tale from the old collection Fables of My Father Swan, which the owner of the apartment read out loud, since the girl herself was too lazy to read herself, and besides, she just liked to sit in his cabinet and listen to his pleasant voice, while not forgetting to comment on what she heard. At the very beginning of this literary reading, the girl even allowed herself to be indignant that the author did not explain the name of the main character, to which Japhet stunned her with the answer, the essence of which was that her own name did not mean always visible, as her mother told her from early childhood, but was the name of the island where, according to ancient Greek myths, the Greek goddess Artemis was born. Having learned about this, the young heiress of the Yonce family then felt as if wave of truth extinguished the fire of falsehood, which she was not slow in admitting to her adult interlocutors. Then Mr. Thurlow said with a smile that she had a good vocabulary, and some kind of light flashed in Jaffe's eyes, hidden behind the thick lenses of his glasses. This moment might have seemed unworthy of attention to the girl, if not for what followed next. When Japhet finished reading the fairy tale and the three of them went to eat beans, at the table he pulled out a notebook, where he wrote down this random remark from Delia from memory, slightly paraphrasing it. The girl then inquired why he needed it, to which she received the answer that it was needed for his research concerning Americans bearing Greek names. Baby girl considered this explanation complete nonsense, gave up on the matter and, deciding that it was time for her to go home, went to get dressed. As Delia and her adult companion approached her family's home, the girl, who had previously been walking behind Joe, suddenly rushed towards him and, grabbing his hand, pulled him strongly to the side. He, trying not to fall to the ground, grabbed the fence with his free hand, accidentally driving a thin sliver of wood into his hand. The little girl opened the gate with a laugh and disappeared into the yard, and Mr. Thurlow, trying to remove a splinter that had gotten into his finger with his teeth, was stunned to catch with his ears the sounds of her footsteps coming from behind the fence. When the front door of the Yonce's house finally closed, he sighed and raised his head. It was dark in the window of her room. I hope you don't mind. The prisoner took a break, if from now on I return to a detailed description of the events that happened to me? Well, you go right ahead, Mr. Inspector Galbraith nodded understandingly. The day after he and Delia returned from Japhet, Joe was awakened by a phone call. He, having forgotten about getting dressed and washed, walked up to the telephone as he was and put the receiver to his ear. It was his neighbor, Mrs. Yonce herself. He, as if fighting with the feeling of dissatisfaction that overwhelmed her, notified Mr. Thurlow that while washing her daughter's underwear, she noticed something strange and therefore in the afternoon she would take her daughter into town on business. Then she took a short pause, apparently waiting for Joe's answer, but he could not find anything in response to these words. In a breaking voice, Yvette added that Mr. Thurlow was very lucky that her spouse and Delia's father was at work at the center at that time. Joe's internal organs appeared to be filled with liquid nitrogen. He felt that above him, like above Damocles, the favorite of the Syracusan tyrant, was hanging the sharpest sword of justice, which threatened to fall down and cut his unfortunate head into two halves. He continued to hold the receiver to his ear, although only beeps could be heard from it. Finally, having mastered his numb limbs, he dropped it next to the telephone and, feeling the ground disappearing from under his feet, managed to grab the tabletop with his hands. In such a pose, vaguely similar to the figure of a sun from a famous painting by Rembrandt, Joe spent, according to personal feelings, no less than 2 hours. Then he stood up and, feeling that he needed fresh air, almost ran out into the street. Thank God that not a single member of the Yonce family caught his eye. Standing near his gate and turning his head from side to side, Mr. Thurlow was convinced that it was still possible to walk calmly on this earth. And he, still feeling the cold in his back, decided to walk to the store. No, not for the sake of shopping, but in order to, in an environment where there are a lot of people, try to get rid of the loneliness that tightens his soul. Trying not to break into a run, Joe directed his steps to where the entire population of the Parkrose neighborhood was purchasing essential goods. Having reached the first tents under which fresh fruit was sold, he suddenly heard his name. It turns out that 2 old women, who at that time were taking red apples from the merchant, were engaged in a lively dialogue with each other. Mr. Thurlow tried to stand behind the awning so that they could not see him and strained his ears. You know, Patricia, I have a suspicion that this scoundrel Jordan obviously did something to the pharmaceutist's daughter, the old woman with a white scarf on her head spoke, muttering her lips. What makes you think that, Elspeth? Her younger friend asked. Because I just met Yvette this morning, exclaimed the interlocutor. She was as pale as death. Oh, the poor. They were connected with what? Well, she said that she asked her daughter to put on new drawers and, while taking her old underwear to wash, she noticed that they were red with blood. What, has the baby started her period? At 8 years old? Yvette couldn't believe her eyes, and forgetting about the laundry, rushed at the girl with questions. And she told her that yesterday she visited certain a Jussie Joe and a Jussie Jaff. 2 murderers. My God. They should sit together. The pharmaceutist's wife has the same opinion. I barely persuaded Yvette to go and get checked by a doctor before calling the police. So what's next? She went home after that. Maybe she really did that, or maybe she couldn't stand it and unleashed police bloodhounds on the bastards. Dear God. Patricia, old lady who was younger, noticed hiding Joe and started screaming. He immediately rushed as fast as he could away from the shops, hearing the words ordinary, scabby, pitiful fiend, flying after him. That's it, he thought, goodbye freedom. And at the same time he asked himself the question of what was happening. He never committed any lewd acts with Delia, avoided kisses and did not even embrace her, and here on you. There is clearly something wrong here, he thought, being already halfway to the house. Meanwhile, clouds began to gather in the sky. Without slowing down, Mr. Thurlow glanced at the far-ahead clearing full of tall grass. It was already the end of September, and now the previously green ocean of plants was colored in shades of yellow and orange. Thick clouds that had already filled the sky with might and main created a very interesting conjunction. And then Joe remembered what the landscape spread out before him looked like. The nature of his native village was almost completely a living embodiment of the cover of the very record that he gave to his young neighbor back in August. He remembered her story about how she gave the record to Jerry, and he supposedly responded to her gift with only thank you, but deep down Joe felt that Delia, in telling him about this incident, was simply limiting herself to only the first half of what actually happened. At the same time, she didn't lie, but she didn't fully tell the truth either. Returning his thoughts to the present, he began to think that if he could trust the words of those two old gossips, then when interrogated by her mother, Delia also did not denigrate him and Japhet. All the same for her reverent parents, for the father in particular, one fact that their little daughter was in the company of two adult men in an unfamiliar apartment was reason enough to hand Joe over to the court butchers, who will pass his mortal body through the knives of the bureaucratic meat grinder. Honestly, it would be better if they killed him right there on the spot than subjected him to such torture. Death is clearly more desirable than such a life. But even saying these words to himself, Mr. Thurlow was still afraid. He was afraid that Delia's furious father would open his skull with his powerful hands, and the fact that under police escort he will be taken to dark and damp dungeons, where he will have to rot until the end of time. Is it really all because of certain gal, the daughter of a paltry medicine seller? Not that this solved anything in the real state of affairs, but Joe could not help but be offended by the fate that brought him, distant relative and descendant of one of the most influential figures of the former, and extremely short-lived, Sorstat Aaron, to the scaffold because of the daughter of some American. When Joe approached his house, the first drops of rain had already begun to fall on the street. Rejoicing at how well he had timed his walk, Mr. Thurlow, without even bothering to check that he had closed the wicket properly, entered the house and followed to the kitchen. From the feeling of threat that still did not want to retreat, he did not feel like eating at all, but he tried to find a bottle with some kind of drink. He just wanted to drown out his fear with alcohol, even the most terrible one imaginable. Alas, there was not a drop of this substance at home, except for the flask, at the bottom of which there was just a little pure 90% alcohol. This amount barely fit on the teaspoon into which Joe shook out the contents of the flask. He put the teaspoon containing the contents into his mouth and exhaled. His throat felt a slight burning sensation. The disgusting bitter taste made him wrinkle his face, but he could not achieve the desired intoxication. It's a shame he didn't buy a bottle of something strong when he went for a walk. In any case, he had to live in freedom, God willing, until tomorrow morning, for a premonition told him that this would not end the matter, and the return of Mr. Yonce will only worsen his already unenviable position. Joe did not know what to do with himself at this time. He couldn't get even a little drunk, and he couldn't try to do anything without this doping. The fear was eating him up from the inside. Therefore, Mr. Thurlow, standing a little near the window, behind which it was already raining, closed the curtains and went into the bedroom, where, without undressing, he immediately climbed under the blanket. He fell asleep the moment his head touched the pillow. He had a dream that he, while still a very small boy, went hunting with his cousin into the forest. A piebald dog of some hunting breed was running behind them. The weather this morning was cloudy, but there was no rain yet, as well as the sun, which had not yet risen. He asked his cousin why they went so early. The grown man looked at the boy and replied something like, "The ducks haven't woken up yet, so it will be easier to shoot them." Little Joe wanted to ask one more question, but then the piebald dog, bursting into barking, rushed forward into the impassable thicket. The expression of complacency immediately disappeared from his cousin's face. It was replaced by the tense expression of a professional hunter who has already smelled the game and is trying not to scare it. The man rushed forward after his dog, holding his hunting rifle at the ready. The boy, who was openly pinched by the heavy boots, could not run after his adult companion in the same way, so little Joe, trying not to slip on the mud, trotted after his cousin. And then a shot rang out. A man was shooting somewhere in the thicket. His piebald dog was squealing wildly. The boy wanted to cover his ears, but his hands seemed to not obey him. And his cousin, to the accompaniment of an increasingly heartrending dog, continued to send shots there, into the thorny branches of the thicket. Joe shuddered and immediately raised his head from the pillows. The dog's heartrending screams continued to ring in his ears, but these were not echoes of the dream he had just seen. Sounds came from the street. Mr. Thurlow, covered in sweat, swung his feet off the bed and, pulling on his slippers, ran out into the yard. The rain, which began in the afternoon, had already turned into a real downpour by nightfall. But Joe, already standing on the porch, did not pay attention to the heavy streams of water that lashed him all over his body. All his attention was occupied by the wild picture that opened before his eyes. Near the wicket, which was wide open, stood a huge man with a bowler hat on his head. He had a pistol in his hands, which he pointed at poor Buffalo. When Mr. Thurlow went outside, the dog didn't even whine anymore. An angry man shot him in the throat 5 times. And when he lifted his head from Buffalo to Joe, the owner of this yard, continuing to stand on the porch, let out a heartrending scream. It was a cry in which fear, pain of loss and wild, all-consuming hatred for the one who was now standing at the wicket were mixed together. What happened next, Mr. Thurlow practically couldn't remember. Only fragments, as if in a delusional dream, remained in his memory. Moments how he then, already soaked through in the rain, rushed towards the killer with his bare fists, how the latter knocked Joe to the ground next to the dead dog with a strong blow to the chest and began to inflict powerful kicks on him with the fury of a wild animal. Then everything around sparkled with blue and red lights. He heard the howl of sirens. Mr. Thurlow remembers how, covered in mud, he was grabbed by 2 men in uniform and thrown like a sack of flour into the back of a truck. And then, no longer in the darkness and not in the dirt, but in a spacious courtroom, he stood and, with his head down, listened to the verdict, according to which he was destined to spend 18 long years in a maximum security colony. With eyes that seemed to be covered with a veil, he looked around at the people gathered at that moment. Not finding among those gathered the one who started it all, his attention was distracted by the scream of his friend Japhet, who stood up and extended his hand forward, apparently pointing at one of the respected members of the trial, angrily recited some fiends eats other fiends. What a great thing to be doing when y'all don't have a humaneness, after which he suddenly grabbed his heart with his other hand and silently fell to the floor, and then the guards grabbed him by the arms like a sack of potatoes and dragged him out of the courtroom. Anyway, that's all, Mr. Inspector. Exhaling, Joe completed his narration. You are unlikely to be interested in how I began to do time in these stinking walls? Well. The prisoner and the policeman sat silently opposite each other. Mr. Thurlow, who wanted to stretch his legs after sitting for a long time, was about to get up, but then his interlocutor raised his hand. Wait, Jordan Thurlow, our meeting isn't over yet. What's the matter, Mr. Inspector? Joe asked him in the tone in which a little boy is trying to get an answer from his strict father about why he can't go for a walk. You told me your half of the story, and I want to tell you mine, Mr. Galbraith answered almost solemnly. What, is it really possible that this family, through whose fault I am here rotting alive, still any incidents happening? You get the point right, Jordan. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Sit down. And Mr. Thurlow sat down on a hard wooden chair. A spark of curiosity began to light up inside him. He suddenly became very interested in what this strong-willed man with a military bearing would tell him now. Who knows, what if? Joe tried to think about Delia as little as possible, but at that moment her small figure was resurrected before his mind's eye. He, trying to cope with the excitement that was bursting through him, answered his interlocutor. I'm all ears, Mr. Inspector. When Mr. Inspector finally told the prisoner his long narration, starting with the incident with the grocery store's pick peanut and ending with his last conversation in the office of the Mr. Chief Inspector Scamore, Galbraith wiped the sweat from his forehead and licked his dry lips. The prisoner was still sitting opposite him on his uncomfortable wooden chair, with his hands folded in front of him. Feeling the expectant gaze of Mr. Inspector on himself, Jordan shuddered all over and raised his right hand to his deathly pale face. What's wrong, aren't you feeling very well? Galbraith asked with sympathy. Wiping the tears from his eyes, Joe sniffed and inhaled noisily. The inspector felt a little uneasy at the sight of the crying criminal, and he involuntarily turned his gaze to the surface of the table at which they had been sitting all this time. At the same time, he wondered what in his story could upset this 26-year-old man so much. Delia, Jordan's whisper reached his ears. Well, yes, exactly, thought Galbraith, it's all because of the girl, the same one who landed him behind bars. With this thought, Mr. Inspector again raised his head to his interlocutor. I see, he began, that some parts of my story upset you. Sorry for this, but these are facts. Speaking these words, the inspector mentally reproached himself. How can you, a policeman, stoop to the point of apologizing to a criminal? The truth hurts, I know, Jordan muttered quietly, blowing his nose into his sleeve. I really don't like this state of affairs myself, Galbraith continued. But you can rest assured. Mr. Inspector suddenly interrupted his speech. He thought it would be very strange if the policeman gave the child molester a promise to bring justice to the child murderer. But the first words of this speech had an effect on the interlocutor. Joe suddenly stopped sniffling and fixed his eyes, red and wet with tears, on Galbraith. You will do your best to, he said with anguish. So that the child's soul can be avenged? I wonder at you, the inspector began, but the prisoner did not let him finish. I want Delia not to feel abandoned in the next world. Do you understand me, Mr. Inspector? Having blurted out these words in despair, Joe then dropped his head into his hands. This plea clearly exhausted him. Galbraith continued to sit silently in his chair, not knowing what to answer to his interlocutor. A minute passed, but Jordan showed no signs of life, and Galbraith thought that the prisoner had fallen asleep. The inspector rose from the table, preparing to leave the interrogation room, but as soon as he took a few steps from the table, Joe suddenly opened his eyelids and, with a quiet groan, grabbed his chest with his hand. When Galbraith quickly walked to the door, which was just behind Mr. Thurlow, and, throwing it open, came face to face with a grim policeman holding a rubber baton, it was a guard who was assigned to monitor what was happening. The inspector immediately turned to him. Take this man back. Clumsy and elderly man gave the inspector some kind of mocking glare. I hope Mr. did not die of boredom, listening to the cruel excuses of this vile P, he began. Joke me here, Inspector threatened him with his finger and quickly left that boring room. Guard, muttering under his breath these are what the nerves need to listen, slowly walked up to the chair behind which Mr. Thurlow was sitting and, tensed slightly, grabbed him by the shoulders with both hands. Joe, whose eyes were feverishly rolling in their sockets, tried to instinctively throw off the fingers that grabbed him, but the guard, with incredible agility for his size, tore the prisoner from the chair and led him back to the cell. The supervisor, standing next to the door leading to the cell, opened it for the guard, who pushed Mr. Thurlow inside. A couple of moments later, the heavy steel door slammed shut, and the sound of the heavy steps of both servant of the order died down in the corridor. Now this man was securely cut off from the other people. But 26-year-old Jordan Thurlow no longer cared about what was happening in this world. He continued to lie on the floor in an uncomfortable position, staring blankly at the wall. It was unbearably stuffy in the cell, so he automatically opened his mouth wider in order to inhale at least a little air. Little by little Joe lost track of where he was, and then suddenly the cheerful cries of children reached his ears. He hardly opened his eyes and was stunned in silent amazement. Around him there was a grass-covered hillock. The midday sun was shining above his head, the birds were singing cheerfully, and ripe orange fruits hung from the branches of the apricot tree under which he lay. Getting to his feet, Joe slowly, as if every step he took was an unbearable burden for him, wandered to the side where the excited hubbub of kids could be heard. After a few steps he involuntarily stopped. What he saw shocked him to the core. Along a well-trodden path straight towards him was approaching a small procession of 5 people. Ahead of all walked, moving her long legs wide in red shoes, young black-haired woman with bob hairstyle. Her cream-colored corduroy dress gave her figure a slightly pompous seriousness, making her look like a primary school teacher. Behind her, like a brood of little ducklings, walked 4 kids, 2 boys and 2 girls. They were barefoot and dressed in colorful dresses, pants and shirts. The children, judging by their pretty faces, were between 7 and 10 years old, no more. The boys, squinting at the bright sun, stayed a little behind. The girls, on the contrary, rushed forward and, cheerfully exchanging glances at each other, constantly tried to overtake their adult mentor. "Mother Joe, look at apricots," came a loud, high-pitched voice. It was shouted by a younger boy who was walking at the very end of the procession. Stretching out his thin hand, he pointed straight at Jordan standing by the tree. He felt a little awkward. It was shameless. All the kids started looking at him. The woman stopped and, turning her head in the same direction where the children were looking, smiled. "Mother Joe, can we eat them?" asked another voice, more softer. This question was asked by a girl in a yellow dress. Curious, Joe, it's short for Josephine, thought Jordan. "Of course, my children," said the black-haired woman and smiled even wider. "You can pick these fruits as much as you like." After her words, the children, all as one, rushed to the tree. Joe, trembling all over, stepped back. "But please, be reasonable." The woman, remaining standing on the road, made a serious face and shook her finger at them. The children, not paying any attention to her warning, ran up to the tree, began to jump up screaming and pick orange apricots from the branches, not at all worried that an unknown adult man was standing literally 2 steps away from them. It seems that this is the first time the kids have seen such a fruitful tree. With amazing tenacity and methodicality, they absorbed the fruits directly from the branches. And it suddenly dawned on Jordan that none of these 4 minors and 1 adult, just doesn't see him. "Are you full, my children?" 5 minutes later, a woman shouted, who remained standing at some distance from the tree. Jordan thought that either she simply didn't like apricots, or that she believed in washing the fruit before eating it. "Mother Joe, maybe a little more," the older boy begged in a capricious tone. "We gotta go on the road." Already with a note of order the woman said, "We have a very long way." The children stopped screaming. They silently looked at each other and with obvious reluctance headed towards the road. The woman waited patiently until all 4 were gathered next to her, and then slowly walked forward. This time the girls barely trudged behind her, and the boys walked ahead and quietly had some kind of argument among themselves. Jordan, who was still standing under the apricot tree, looked with some sadness after the retreating procession. He involuntarily felt like a worthless, useless person, whom no one would ever remember and, as he had just seen, no one noticed. While thinking about this, Jordan suddenly noticed that one of the girls, who was walking last, suddenly stopped. He thought that she apparently wanted to take a breath, but when she turned her head towards him with a black bang on her forehead, he felt his heart begin to beat wildly. Because that girl was none other than Delia herself. Her bottomless eyes looked at him point blank. She looked divine in her dark blue dress. She smiled as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time, and began to slowly approach the tree. Jordan couldn't believe his eyes and thought it was just a hallucination. He awkwardly backed away and, burying his back in the trunk of an apricot tree, slid down it to the ground. The little girl apparently thought it was funny. She laughed and extended her hand forward. Jordan sat there, hesitantly, under the tree for a few seconds, and then, blushing, he took Delia's hand and smiled timidly. They never allowed themselves hugs, kisses, or any other way of expressing love that required physical contact. Their feelings for each other could be called silent emotional attachment or the most banal sympathy. Now, as Delia stood in front of Jordan, sitting on the lawn, he wanted to tell her a lot. For example, give her a compliment that she has become even more beautiful. Ask if anyone is hurting her. Apologize to her for the long separation. In the end, just ask if she's happy to see him. But he still couldn't think of the right words. Jordan, still holding her tender hand in his rough palm, swallowed the lump that had risen in his throat and, trying to keep his voice from trembling from the excitement that overwhelmed him, almost whispered only one word. "Sweetheart." A sort of smile was appeared on his lips. In response to this word, Delia's cheeks were blushed. She let go of her hand and gave him a somewhat shy smile. Ideal of a mankind, Jordan thought, or, more precisely, womankind. As he understood, she was already 10 years and 4 months old. He felt something like remorse for the fact that 2 years ago he had so unceremoniously entered Delia's small cozy world. But he could not do anything, after all, the past cannot be returned. I know. I remember, unexpectedly, Delia said quietly. Jordan felt that her voice had changed in a strange way, but it could only seem to him, after all, that he had not seen her for a long time. And yet, hearing that "I remember," he felt his heart clench. Well, when such an subject of the highest virtue speaks, my skin is starting to crawl, Jordan thought, not taking his eyes off her. Jussie, there won't be any trouble, now, Delia repeated quite clearly and distinctly. I promise, she added. He wanted to ask what kind of trouble, but the girl did not give him such an opportunity. Tears flowed from Delia's eyes, and the next moment she suddenly rushed to grown man and wrapped her thin arms around him. Jordan, forgetting about everything in the world, grabbed Delia by the shoulders, and, pressing baby to him, began to stroke her head. The little girl's body, trembling with sobs, radiated a faint warmth.